The sprint is on now in the NBA season, and we have three big questions to ask next on Beyond the Locker Room. Less than 30 games left in the season. At this point in the season, post All-Star break, we get into the jockeying. And I'm going to break down three big questions I have that I think, we should also look into, and I think will have a big impact on how this season may play out. Question one, the Jayson Tatum question. When will he come back? Because I don't think it's an if now. I think it's a when. During the All-Star game, they had a big, huge, a vignette on his recovery and the process. He sounds like a man that is expecting to return. If that is the case, and I believe that is the case, Boston is a completely different team at that point. Right now, they're in the second spot in the East. That's a big difference if he's there. All of a sudden, now they are looking like a true title contender, and that is something they have to consider, or other teams have to consider. In the East, or how to manage that, and that's a huge issue. I think Boston, with how Jaylen Brown's looking, I already said he's an MVP candidate in my mind. You throw in Jayson Tatum, and he doesn't even have to be 100%. If he hits 70%, maybe 80%, that may be enough. Definitely in the East to get them over the hump with how the rest of the team is playing. So, and they have that experience as well too. So watch for that. Tatum's gonna be a big story there coming up for sure. Question number two. Who's going for that number one spot? All right, a little Luda, paying a little homage to Luda for the All-Star break. Question is, we didn't even think this was going to be a question actually, 4 weeks ago, maybe, definitely 8 weeks ago. But when we went into the All-Star break, Detroit had the best record in the league, and the question is now, who will have that number one spot when the season's done? Obviously, we know how important the home court advantage is in the NBA. It may not as important as it used to be due to ticket shares and selling tickets off online and stuff like that. But having home court in a Game 7 is still a real valuable thing to have. And if you have it throughout the playoffs, hey man, that's a feather in your cap. So watching to see if Detroit, OKC, or perhaps the team I get into next as my third question will be an interesting story. And I guess from the OKC side, what we have to ask ourselves is if what we're seeing is just more of a championship hangover. They've had some injuries and been nicked up a bit, but so has everyone in some ways. Are we seeing more of a trend where people are starting to kind of figure them out a little bit? One thing to keep in mind, I've been watching kind of closely, is the type of teams that have been beating OKC. A lot of it seems to be a lot of teams that have a lot of big athletic wings, it seems to me. Something to keep an eye on as we get into the playoffs when it gets down to matchups and see how that plays out. On the Detroit side, the trade, that trade on their side was a nice trade. Particularly for the Saric element of it, I think they need another big. He can help give you an extra 5-10 minutes when needed. He gives you some outside shooting, so he can space the floor really well for Cade and those wings to get in the lane. So I like that deal overall, just for the depth standpoint as well too. So that's a key one there for Detroit, and seeing how that will play out as they, I think at the moment, unless something really changes, they're pretty secure for the number one seed. As far as number one seeds goes, the West, I'll speak about my third question now. How far can the San Antonio Spurs go? The man-child, Big Vic, my man, I said 2 years ago was a top 10 player. And folks were shocked. And it's like, no, he's a top 10 player. I'm now going so far to say now he's a top 3 player in the league at this point. And I think watching him in his development going to these playoffs, I think is going to be fascinating. I love his mindset. And I'll get into a little bit more of that in the All-Star, my locker room take about the All-Star game. But he is, a guy that is looking to, he's not waiting around for his turn. He is coming now. And San Antonio has the type of team which I thought would give OKC trouble. Once again, big wings, a lot of length, a lot of physicality, and I do wonder, and then throw him in the middle, which really clogs up the paint, forcing them to be pretty much a perimeter team at a lot of times. This is going to be a really fascinating development if they get on the same side of the bracket, whenever that may be. But the Spurs right now, they're a hard team to match up with their athleticism, their depth, their youth. their skill set. They're a handful to handle. That 3 guard rotation is as potent as it comes. Throwing Wemby in there as well too. The vets that they have, it's a nice combination that Mitch Johnson has, and he can rely on. So the Spurs, in my mind, is a really interesting team to watch. Be wary of them for that. I'll throw in one bonus question, and this one's a local one for the Raptor fans around here. Can the Raptors maintain a top 6 seed? Right now, the Raptors are a game and a half ahead of Philadelphia at the moment. They're in the 5th spot right now. They're about 3 games, I believe, ahead of Orlando and I think Miami. Be wary of what you see, Raptor fans. You are not home free yet. Consider these factors. Philadelphia will have Embiid playing more games as the season ends. And then also throw in the fact that Miami has some games in hand. I think a couple of games in hand. Keep that in mind. And Orlando should be getting Franz back at some point during the end of this season. Those are like, the Embiid and Franz scenarios are like getting free agents. Be wary that you think that you have 5 sealed up. What I think is going to start happening is I think you're going to have Detroit continue to do what they're doing, and then there's going to be this next group of Boston, I suspect New York, and Cleveland that are going to be this next tier. And then the 3rd tier is where the Raptors are trying to maintain right now. Can they in Philadelphia stay in that next tier? And I don't know. It's going to be interesting or fascinating. It's a question we will definitely have answered in about 6 weeks' time. We'll find out if the Raptors have been able to maintain and stay above the Mendoza line. Put your thoughts and comments down below. I'm curious to see what you think about these 4 questions I had, or 3 questions plus the bonus, what your thoughts are on that. Locker room takes. All-Star game is finished, over the weekend. I'll go through 2 ways I'll look at it. One, I'll start with the broadcast. I thought the broadcast was great. I thought NBC was a breath of fresh air. How they built up the players, built up the league, brought the history of the league into it, treated it with some sort of reverence, I think was important. All the little things they did. For example, they made vignettes before they introduced every dunker. I thought that was great. Another little switch they did was to get things kicked off, starting off instead of a sleepy format with the skills. Which, by the way, the skills competition was actually quite good. Actually, I thought it was very entertaining. They started off with the 3-point competition, which I think was a good movement from a format standpoint. And then, their introductions and how they set up the All-Star game with the history of the All-Star game on Sunday. I just thought they made it about what it should be made of, which is about the league. They didn't make it about themselves. I won't go the reason of other broadcasts that may have happened, but I'll just say this, that I thoroughly enjoyed it overall throughout the whole weekend. And based on what I saw in the preliminary numbers, the ratings have shown that people are receptive to it too compared to last year's. I'll just leave it at that. I see you go back here on one of my previous podcasts to see what I had to think about the broadcast changes in that one below. So you could, or that one above, I should say, to check out what I think about the broadcasting changes. Very happy, let's put it that way. The other side of it is on the floor, and the product on the floor. As I mentioned before, the NBA dunk contest, it was a tough one, but I mean, I've seen worse. I think we're at a point just for the dunk contest. Like, I don't know what people want. I don't know if they expect people to have rocket boosters on them at this point, or, be able to stretch themselves out like Mr. Fantastic. Like, at some point, we have to be honest, there's a limitation of what humans can do. And there's not much else, folks groused when they brought in props. Oh, we don't want the props. Well, if you're not bringing in the props, you really cut down the options from a creativity standpoint. There's only so many ways you can manipulate a ball to dunk it. That's just a fact. So this idea, and I think that's one of the problems right now, is that guys are trying to find some crazy, spectacular ways to do so, and it makes the execution so much more difficult. So I'm not sure how I'm not sure if there's any way to, quote, fix the dunk off. I think you're going to have some good ones. You're going to have some bad ones. We've had some great ones. We had one of the best ones ever in Toronto right here. Between, I believe it was, who was it that year? Aaron Gordon and Zach LaVine, I think it was. Yeah. And that was, I think it was the rematch. They had that one. Was that the rematch here with Toronto? I do notice the one where the mascot was spinning around, I think, and then Aaron Gordon dunked it. Which was some unique stuff. Now, obviously, that was about 10 years ago. We've had some other ones that have been pretty decent. As far as the encore product goes, I thought it was really a good idea of having young versus old, world versus America. It gave stakes to each matchup. I thought it was very entertaining. Obviously, the old guys ran out of gas, but I don't agree with folks by mixing it up next year. I think that dynamic needs to be there to have the stakes and have the ego of each team having something to fight for against the other guys. So that was a nice dynamic. Plus, also, too, there's plenty of guys that are in their prime playing on that team, like Brunson and Brown. So, like, come on, folks. But overall, man, fantastic weekend for the NBA. I think it was great. The ratings show it. And I think they got a winning formula. So we'll see where it takes us. Once again, guys, you can find me on X, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, and of course right here on YouTube. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Love to hear your thoughts in the comment section of some of the things I discussed today. Anyways, guys, we'll check me out, right here on YouTube as well as on Basketball Rewind Weekly. Talk to you later. Peace.